All right. Well, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon for you, Melanie. It's our pleasure today to have Melanie Bell from the University of Arizona. So Melanie works as a professor in the Mel and Nate Zuckerman College of Public Health, and she is in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics. So today, Melanie will talk about analytical and design issues for cluster randomized trials, which was, I guess, the seminar that she had planned to give us a few weeks ago. She would have been able to stay in Australia. So thanks, Melanie, for giving this online talk, and we look forward to hearing you.
Great. So thank you for allowing me to give this talk still online. Like I said, I'm sorry to have cut my sabbatical short and missed some of you, but at least I get to do this. Okay, so my outline for my talk is I'm going to just introduce myself. Speak a little bit about cluster randomized trials with a general intro and some CRTs that I've been involved with, and then some methodological issues in CRTs. My idea here is just to give kind of an overview of several research projects that I've been involved with on cluster randomized trials, involving design, generalized estimating equation with small sample size, missing data in cluster trials, and the mixed model for repeated measures. Okay, so as Boris said, I am Melanie Bell. So my connection to your part of the world is when I finished my PhD, I went directly to the University of Otago, which is on the South Island of New Zealand, and I was there for several years. And then I went to the University of Sydney, and I was working with the Psycho-Oncology Cooperative Research Group, which is one of the Cancer Australia trials groups, focusing mainly on psychosocial outcomes. And in 2014, I moved back to Arizona, which is in Tucson, and that's where I am currently. But I am on sabbatical, and I am sheltering in place, actually. And this is probably what a lot of your workspaces look like as well right now, right? So getting a lot of work done with my cats. Okay, so my areas of interest are missing data primarily, but I also do quite a bit in patient-reported outcomes, cluster trials, and statistical methods of translation. What I mean by that is, I'm aware that there are a lot of really great methods out there, but they stay in the statistical literature, and some naive and ad hoc methods mostly get used in applied research. So I'm trying to translate that. Okay, so the University of Arizona, as I mentioned, it's in Tucson, Arizona, just 60 miles north of the Mexican border. It's a pretty large university, 45,000 students, an R01 or a R1 research university, and during the mad scramble to change online to online classes, I was driving through the outback, so I missed that whole thing. So I'm sure that many of you can relate to the difficulties of that, and I will probably have to go through that myself. Okay, so yes, Arizona is the Grand Canyon state and a home of the iconic saguaro. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that I've worked on in cluster trials, primarily focused around these several papers. All right, so let's get into it. So cluster trials, I'm sure that a lot of you are aware about what they are, but depending on your background, you might not be. A lot of the straight math stats people are not aware of cluster trials. This is where we randomize intact groups rather than individuals. That might be hospitals, families, schools, clinics. And why do we do this? There are several reasons. The intervention may be at the cluster level, and so there also can be issues with contamination if you were to try to randomize at the individual level, or there just may be logistics that make it so that you cannot randomize individuals and you have to randomize clusters instead. So the example that I'm going to kind of return back to occasionally in this talk is called metasolute diabetes. And if you'd like to learn more about that, here's the study protocol. It was a cluster randomized trial to reduce cardiovascular disease risk among a diabetic population in Mexico. We had 22 diabetes clinics from northern Mexico in the state of Sonora. The intervention, MSD, was a 13-week health promotion or cardiovascular disease risk reduction intervention. As you might be aware of, people with diabetes have higher risk for CVD, and they usually have worse outcomes as well. So the idea was to try to improve diet, exercise, get glucose under control, reduce stress. So the intervention was at the cluster level because it was at these diabetes clinics. And so that's why we did a cluster randomized trial. However, the measurement of cardiovascular disease risk is at the individual level. So our primary outcome was the Framingham CVD risk score, which is equal to the absolute risk of CVD in the next 10 years. So this was measured at baseline, 3 months, and 12 months. The risk score is a combination of blood pressure, age, diabetes, whether you're on medication for blood pressure, and smoking status, and a few other things that I don't recall at the moment. Okay, but as typical of a statistician, I'm more interested in the design. So in a cluster randomized trial, you have an induced dependence because clusters are going to be more similar. People within clusters are going to be more similar than people outside of clusters. So the sample size must be increased by the design effect. Now, the design effect is defined as 1 plus m minus 1 times the intracluster correlation coefficient. Okay, so the m is the average cluster size, and that ICC is the ratio of the between variance cluster, or between cluster variance with the total variance. So when you're designing your study, you might be thinking, where would I get estimates of the ICC? Well, you might look at a paper that Joanne McKenzie and I did. So some of you might know Jo McKenzie. She's at Monash, and we knew each other back from when we were both living in Dunedin, New Zealand. So this is a paper that I just asked all the people that I knew if they could look at their data and estimate their the variance components, and so the ICC between commonly used psychosocial measures. And so what you want to do is try to say, well, what patient population is closest to the one that I'm designing a study for, and what outcome is most similar, and use ICCs from that. We found that an estimate of ICC equals 0.01 is a pretty reasonable estimate, and I found that in my own experience as well as according to this research and in the literature as well. There are certain outcomes that have a higher ICC, like surgical trials where surgeon skill really is going to play a large part, and so there will be a high clustering, a high correlation within a surgeon. Okay, so this is how I wrote that up in the grant proposal. So you see I'm accounting for these design effect, noting how many clusters and how many participants per cluster, and accounting for dropout and that ICC. You should always think about dropout and missing data. In this particular case, we did have 2 clusters in the control arm that were eventually dropped due to security concerns for the safety of the research staff. Because as you might know, northern Mexico, there's a lot of problems with narcotics there, and we decided that that was not safe, even though our partners were from the Mexican state of Sonora. All right, so we had a little bit of imbalance, 12 clusters in the intervention arm and 10 in the control arm. So you have to account for the clustering in the design, but you also must account for the clustering or the non-independence in the analysis as well. So there are 3 primary methods that, that one can use to account for this non-independence. Okay, so you can analyze at the cluster level. So that would mean that rather than looking at individual data, you summarize that, say with a mean or a proportion, and then you no longer have that correlation within cluster because you only have one value per cluster. So the problem with that is that you do lose a lot of power and you lose a lot of subtlety of the data, so you are wasting some. The other 2 primary methods are both at the individual level, that includes the generalized estimating equations and mixed models. Okay, so that leads me to my next little research study that I did with a couple of graduate students. And this was looking at GEE in cluster trials with a small number of clusters. So a review of practice and simulation study. So our aim was to evaluate the use of GEE bias correction methods in recently published CRTs, and then with the simulation study to demonstrate the necessity of such methods, the bias correction, when the number of clusters is small. So background about bias correction methods. The sandwich variance estimator is used for GEE is biased when the number of clusters is small. So defining small to be less than 40, which is kind of what is agreed upon in the literature and in textbooks. So this results in an inflated type 1 error, but there are several bias correction methods. So Mansell and Derowan, Cowerman and Carroll, several more. And you can also use jackknife or bootstrap methods. But this is one of those cases where we've got methods in the statistical literature that aren't really being translated to applied research. Or so I thought, and we'll see that that is in fact the case. So we reviewed, or I had my students review, cluster trials published between August 2013 and July 2014 that used GEE for their primary analyses, and we recorded the number of clusters and the use of bias correction methods. So we had 51 cluster trials which used GEEs, okay, and we found that over half of them had the number of clusters were less than 40, okay? And you might even notice that there are studies that had clusters, number of clusters of 4. And in fact, I've had, and I'm sure some of you have as well, have had people come and try to talk to me about designing a cluster trial with 2 clusters. And that, of course, can't be done, right? Because cluster is confounded with treatment. Okay, so we also found that out of all the trials that had a small number of clusters, only one used a bias correction, okay, for their variance. So we also did a simulation study looking at the average type 1 error. We did 5,000 simulations, varying the number of clusters, the cluster size, and the ICC. So we let the cluster size be 10 and 100, and the ICC be 0.01, which is fairly small, but it's actually the average from this kind of studies that I work in, up to 0.1, which is quite a bit larger. And then we let the number of clusters vary from 4 to 40. And none of that really seemed to matter. So I'm just going to focus on one of those scenarios where the cluster size was 10. And what you should be very concerned about is that the type 1 error, when you have 4 clusters, is 0.47. Okay, so about half of the time you're going to be making a type 1 error. So now, again, this is not uncommon in my experience for people to come to me and say, I want to do a cluster trial. I've only got a few clusters though. How many do you have? Well, I've got 4, maybe I can get 6. So I usually try to persuade them to find another design, but sometimes you're stuck. So we see that once you get up to about 40, you're looking a little bit better at about 0.06 for your type 1 error. So the summary for this little study of the 51 included trials, about over half analyzed 40 or fewer clusters with a minimum of 4 total clusters. Of these, only one trial used a bias correction method. Simulation study showed that with 4 clusters, type 1 error rate ranged between 0.43 and 0.47, but moved towards the nominal level as the number of clusters increased, but still ranged between 0.06 and 0.07 for 40 clusters. Okay, so that's if you use GEE, be aware of that. Okay. So another analytical approach is mixed models. Okay, again, we want to be able to account for the non-independence that you get from having a cluster trial. But suppose your outcome is measured repeatedly over time, such as in the metasalud diabetes, where we not only have the non-independence due to clusters, but also because we were measuring that diabetes risk score at baseline, 3 months, and 12 months. So how do we handle that in this case? Well, that's the subject of my next little mini subject here. So the mixed model for repeated measures for cluster randomized trial, a simulation study investigating bias and type 1 error with missing continuous data, again with another graduate student, and this was just recently published in BMC Trials. So the motivation for this, I had a couple of motivating reasons why I looked into this particular area. So missing data. Okay, as I said before, missing data is my area of research, and if any of you work in trials, you know that missing data are pretty much inevitable. Okay, so I did with some students a systematic review and of cluster randomized trials, and showed that 93% have missing data, and they have a fair bit, okay, including entire clusters missing, which was the case for us when we had to remove those 2 clusters in northern Sonora. So this level of missingness is similar to reviews that I've done for individually randomized trial and non-inferiority trials as well. So if you want to see further of the results of that, the review of missing data in cluster trials. Here's the reference for that. And then here's the other two reviews for individual trials and non-inferiority trials. Okay, so we have missing data. Well, one way to deal with missing data is use likelihood-based mixed models because they can handle non-independent data, and they're robust in the presence of missing data for individually randomized trials. So one particular type of mixed model is the mixed model for repeated measures. So this is a very popular model for longitudinal RCTs with regular assessment times. So such as in the MSD trial where we had 0, 3 months, and 12 months, rather than say at the beginning of treatment and at the end of treatment where treatment can be variable, or every time you come in. That would be not regular assessment times. So as I said, the MMRM is popular. It's used quite a bit in the pharmaceutical industry. What is it? We use an unstructured or categorical time and covariance, and what's nice about that is you are unlikely to misspecify the model rather than putting some kind of functional form on those trajectories over time. You just let the outcome take whatever trajectory it wants. So what's nice about likelihood-based mixed models is that they are unbiased for data missing completely at random, and at random as long as you have specified the model correctly, and as I said before, model misspecification is unlikely. So it is a nice model to use. So if you don't know what I'm talking about with the types of missingness, I'll just take a short aside here, talk about my favorite topic of missing data. So outcome data are missing completely at random, or MCAR, if there are no systematic differences between values that are observed and missing. We say that data are missing at random if, after taking account of observed data, conditioning on it somehow or another, in your model or an imputation model, there are no systematic differences between observed and missing outcome values. And then the worst is anything else. So data are missing not at random when missingness depends on the value of the missing data itself, even after you've conditioned on observed data. Okay, so this confusing nomenclature is due to Donald Rubin, and it's been around for years, so it's probably not going to change. Anyway, so back to motivation. Okay, my second piece of motivation to do this study. I was asked to review a paper where it said that mixed models for repeated measures are inappropriate for cluster trials when there are more than 2 time points. And then I realized that there were a couple of other papers that said this same thing. So this was my plan for how I was going to analyze the metasalud diabetes when the data finally came in. And so I did a quick simulation study and I said, wow, this looks like it's fine. I'm getting perfect type 1 error rate. So I decided to do a more in-depth simulation study and look at the MMRM for CRT. And this is not really a new model. Other people have done it, but I just kind of needed to say, this works. So all I did was just add a random effect for cluster to the regular mixed model for repeated measures. So here's our linear mixed model for subject I, and if we have n planned assessments, our residual variance covariance matrix R sub I is n by n. So for MSD, the metasalud, it's a 3 by 3 matrix. and G is then a scalar, so because you only have the one random effect, and because that's for cluster. Okay? So you might find it more intuitive to just think about this in terms of code. This is what it looks like in SAS. You see that we've got the unstructured time and as well as the unstructured R matrix, that covariance matrix, and you can put that in the repeated statement, as well as the random effect for cluster. And then you can see that what I did here was I just estimated the difference at a particular time point using a contrast statement. Okay, so if you are more of an R user, you can find R code for this in the paper. I asked my student to also try to figure out how to do it in Stata. She said that it couldn't be done, but maybe it just couldn't be done by her. All right, and to her credit, she was not a Stata user. I thought she did a pretty good job of learning as much Stata as she did. All right, so we did a simulation study simulating a 2-arm cluster trial with the continuous outcome, baseline, and 3 post-intervention time points. So remember that the reviews said if you have more than 2 time points, that this model is inappropriate. So I've got 4 time points. So we varied that intercluster correlation and the number of clusters per arm and the cluster size. And we also varied the data generation method. So I think that this is something that I think is important, but isn't often done in a lot of simulation studies. Like we simulate data from a model that we're going to then use to analyze the data, and then we say, oh, look, it worked. But maybe that's not a big use 3 different data generation models, and none of them are going to be from the model that I actually use to analyze the data. So my models were random effects for subject and cluster, so this induced a compound symmetric covariance matrix. I used a Toeplitz covariance matrix, so that's kind of a dropping off as time points get further apart, but not as extreme as, say, an exponential decay. And then I used random effects for subject and cluster intercepts and cluster slopes. So I induced 30% missing data with a missing at random mechanism, so that the missingness of outcome Y for the ith person at the jth time was dependent on that person's outcome for the previous time, J minus 1. We simulated under the null and the alternative and looked at type 1 error, bias, and coverage. And the results were pretty much what I thought they would be. The estimates of treatment effect were unbiased. The variance component estimates were unbiased. The coverage was mostly nominal. That third simulation method where I had all the random effects, when there was a larger intercluster correlation, the coverage, I had some under coverage there. So coverage ranged from 90 to 94%, and my type 1 error ranged from 2.7 to 8.1%, again with larger values with method 3. This actually happens to be as close as I could come to replicating the data generation method from the 1998 paper of Murray's that he was then basing all his future reviews on, saying this is why this particular analysis is incorrect. So it did work the worst when you use this particular method, but it wasn't bad, and several other methods, or 2 other methods, worked pretty well. So again, the ICC was larger at 0.1, but as I mentioned before, various reviews of empirical ICCs, including my own, show that typical ICCs are around 0.01, but definitely this depends on study context. So I concluded that the mixed model for repeated measures for cluster randomized trials has good statistical properties, gives unbiased results for data which are missing at random, it's easily implemented in SAS and R, and it's a good choice for the analysis of cluster trials with longitudinal continuous outcomes collected at fixed time points. Again, at pre-specified time points where everyone is getting those same values or assessment times. But caution if you have larger ICC or greater cluster heterogeneity. And so this is what I wrote in the grant. By the way, we did get a large NIH R01 grant for this. Okay, so I used the repeated measure for mixed models, which use an unstructured time and covariance, and I adjusted for my stratification factors. And right, so what did we actually find in Metasalud? Well, the results were not overwhelming. The cardiovascular disease risk was about 3.2 percentage points lower in the intervention arm as compared to the control arm at the final time point at 12 months. Just kind of barely so, p equals 0.01. And at, that was at 3 months. At 12 months, the difference was only 2.1 percentage points lower, and it was no longer significant. So the results of this, again, we're not an overwhelming success, although I do think that Mexico the Ministry of Health is going to try to implement this program. We also found that various secondary outcomes, none of them were statistically significant either, except for diabetes distress, which you can imagine getting in together with these groups and discussing diabetic control would probably, and eating right and exercising probably helps with that. All right, so I am going to conclude there. I go to a lot of statistics talks where there's absolutely no time to get any questions in, and I often want to ask questions, so I always aim for about 40 minutes. I also know that people have other things they want to get off to do, so I will just finish this slide by saying that the cluster randomized trial is a useful design, but you do have to take into account the clustering in both the design and the analysis. I have actually seen a reference out there when I'm reviewing grants that says if your ICC is below 0.1, you don't need to worry about it, and that is not true. And those grants that try to pass that by me, I never give them a good score. Must take it into account. You also don't want to test that ICC either, because whenever you're testing variance components, you're right on the edge of the space for a chi-square test, and so you're not getting a proper test. So you should just account for it. Okay. If a small number of clusters is used, less than 40, you should either avoid generalized estimating equations or use a bias correction for standard errors. You know, these bias corrections they're part of standard software. You know, there are SAS options for it. I'm sure there are as well for Stata and for R. So these things are implemented, they just don't get used. And then finally, the MMRM for CRT is a reasonable analytical approach for continuous outcomes. I guess I also should have said you should always be thinking about missing data. It's always much better to handle it and try to prevent it rather than trying to handle it analytically, but you're still going to get some. And this was the start of my sabbatical. We bike packed on the Old Ghost Road in New Zealand, and it was atypically beautiful weather, and it was a lovely 5 days just biking and staying in huts. All right, so that's it. If there are any questions, I'm not sure how to take those questions, but Boris can help me.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie. That was great. If anyone has any question, you can click on raise your hand, and then your name will appear, and you can ask your question by unmuting yourself. So I had AF as a question.
Hi, this is Andrew Forbes from Monash University in Melbourne. Thanks very much for a really nice talk, Melanie. Just wonder if you could comment, just at the very end, you said for continuous data, if you had binary data, how might you approach the modelling?
Well, thank you for that, Andrew. You know, I'm sure that you get a different answer to the question, right? If you use a mixed model for binary data versus a GEE, right? Because you're getting, with the GEE, you're getting that population averaged, and with a mixed model, a generalized linear mixed model, you would be getting a subject specific, and some people prefer the population averaged. So it depends on what question you want to answer. I don't know whether this a similar approach to this using generalized linear mixed models would work as well, whether it has good statistical properties or not. Other questions?
There's a question from Jessica.
Hi, Melanie. Thanks for a great talk. I'm Jessica Kaiser. I'm also at Monash University in Melbourne. I mean, it's fantastic that this talk has been broadcast live so that we down here in Melbourne can watch it too. Yeah. I've got a question about this. So there are so many different methods for bias correction with GEEs. Mm-hmm. So my question is a two-part one. One, how do you select the bias correction method to use? And two, what are your thoughts on Bayesian methods in this space?
How do we select? I would say that, yeah, if you want to go with a GEE, you would probably have to dive into that literature some. But what I would say probably is just something is better than nothing. And it does seem that, like, when I read about it myself, it seems like the people do like the Fay and Grabard correction as well as the Mansell and de Rohan. But again, just something is better than nothing, so you're not getting that really highly inflated. But if you have close to 40 clusters, it's probably not that big of a deal, and you can sometimes penalize yourself if you use a correction, right? In terms of your second question, I am not a Bayesian myself, and that is just because I'm lazy. So, but I think the idea of Bayesianism is great, and I applaud whenever one can use Bayesian methods. Yeah. So I'm not sure what the best approach for that is here, but I know that it is a robust method for handling missing data, and so I think it would be a great way to analyze a cluster trial, especially with repeated measures within. Other questions?
Yeah, Melanie, I had one. Is the reason why the GE not working so well when you have a small number of clusters, is it because it's non-parametric, and so you don't have that many clusters, so it doesn't work too well? Is that the reason, and is it easy to implement as well?
I'm not sure. It's not just the number of clusters. So I did a simulation study several years ago looking at small sample size for count data, and GEE also then gave really highly inflated type 1 error rates. I'm not sure why it does. Yeah, I can't answer that.
Thanks.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I just looked a little bit in estimating equations, so that's why I was wondering if I could get some insight. Are there any?
It's certainly not something that I have discovered by myself. This is a well-known problem with GE, which is why there are so many bias correction methods out there, because it's well known. But it's well known amongst statisticians, but not in applied research. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. No, I was just going to ask if there were any other questions from the audience or comments.
Boris, this is Armando. I don't know how to raise my hand here. Can you
That's
hear
okay.
me? Yeah.
Yes.
Can I just add a comment, Melanie, to see if you agree regarding the question about the number of clusters and the bias in the variance estimate? Well, the result for the Sandwich estimate is asymptotic. So if you have a very, very small number of clusters, you're far away from large N equivalent to number of clusters. So I would imagine that the result for the Sandwich doesn't hold, or
Yeah, I think you're right, Armando, that it's just an issue with asymptotics, and we're just, those results depend on the asymptotics, and we're not there yet with that number of clusters. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Armando. All right, so I think we can thank you, Melanie, for this great talk. And the talk will be put online, and the link will be sent around soon, so anyone can watch it again.
All right, well, thank you very much.
And yeah, that's the end of the day for you, so
yeah, I'm going to go have
a good evening.
All right, goodbye.